Good afternoon. My name is Mary Beth Semerod, and I am excited to be part of the Millersville University's Learning Institute Global Wellbeing and Social Change Conference. For the next 30, 40 minutes, I'm going to try to share with you a great experience that I had conducting dissertation research related to the lived experience of stigma surrounding mental illness. As many of you may discover as you listen to me talk about this research, there were a few unexpected, unintended consequences that were not only had a powerful impact on me, but I think had a powerful impact on my practice as a social worker. I was very fortunate in that I had an opportunity to have conversations with 18 individuals, 18 adults, who are members of the Clubhouse community. Uh, we talked a little bit about their experiences in living with mental illness as well as their experiences related to stigma. And I am deeply grateful that they took the time to help educate me, not only about how important it is that we fully understand this, um, but also what it feels like. So, and that's where I'm going to try to explain how I tried to unpack this phenomenon and understand it from the perspectives of individuals most affected. So today I am going to outline my study, do a little walkthrough where I'll take you through the research of this phenomenon that interests me and how I was able to shape that into a study um, that it actually resulted in a model that I will share with you that I think is helpful for us to inform practice. I I sort of went off the beaten path in terms of research presentation of results, in that usually we wait till the end and talk about our findings and talk about our results couched in the process of analysis. But the results that I found were so powerfully connected to the sentiment and the observation and the perspectives of those 18 individuals I interviewed that I wanted to take their quotes and I intersperse them throughout this presentation. I'll explain how I categorize the themes uh, towards the end of the presentation, but here's an example of one. In the conversation early on, we talked about living with mental illness, and this individual made it clear that the problem is not just that we don't know. The problem is that we can't sometimes get to understand the other person's perspective. And as noted, um, they are missing the other person's perspective. In order to understand something, you can't just see it just from your eyes. You have to see the whole picture and everything that was involved. When I heard this individual share that, I knew I was on the right path. I did not define stigma for my participants. I used the study as a way to gain access to their understanding of what stigma means. And again, right from the beginning, it was very clearly stated that stigma is intentional. It's not your imagination, it's not a misunderstanding. It is an intentional choice to act in demeaning ways towards somebody. And even though, as noted here, it may be hidden or disguised as control, but it's more than that. My study examined this phenomenon, the lived experience of stigma surrounding mental illness, specifically from the perspectives of individuals who are in the mental health recovery process. My research was driven by two primary objectives. I believed that stigma is both a personal as well as a very sensitive topic. So I wanted to explore that subjective experience, but I also wanted to understand its effects, particularly on social relationships. And through that process, I was hoping to unpack a little bit some of the factors or that they might be revealed into how and when and under what circumstances do we become aware of stigma, experience it, and it has its influence on our relationships in different settings. So the background of information, the background of research was extensive. I will spare you the 30 pages of references that became part of this research study. But I have worked in the field of mental health for a long time. So I thought it was a great place to start was back where I had entered into it. It was also, by coincidence, a really critical point in the mental health system growth process. So I started working in the field in the 1970s, unaware completely that I was entering the field at the time of one of the most major movements to take place, and that's the deinstitutionalization movement. After much effort, individuals, the locus of control was no longer going to be individuals living with mental illness in institutions. Individuals were going to be coming home to their community. And that process took a long time for many communities. Although the Mental Health Centers Act was passed in 1963, it took almost 10 years for that money to trickle down to local levels where the systems of services greatly changed. But the deinstitutionalization movement carried with it the need not just for the community to respond and accept individuals living with mental illness, but it involved all of us to better understand what this problem is. And is it a problem? Is it a part of it is a part of life that for some individuals, is it similar to living with a physical illness? So through that process of deinstitutionalization, and again, my early work was guided when I first entered as an intern, guided by the work of Wolf Wolfensberger's normalization. I got the concept that this was not only new to serve people in the community, but that many people were coming home to stay in their neighborhoods much longer than they had ever lived in the community since diagnosis. We started to see throughout society a significant rise in the number of cases of mental illness. What precipitated the decade of the brain in 1990 was also the need for more research to understand the significant increase of neurological disorders that were individuals presenting with symptoms of and were diagnosed at that time. So I think it's important that although the decade of the brain was a significant moment of funding for research and great progress was made, it is because of research that I think deinstitutionalization was made possible too. The increase of the effectiveness of psychotropic medications is what made it possible for some individuals to be able to survive and thrive in local communities. But the decade of the brain was, as helpful as it was just the beginning. You know, think about what some of the things that were revealed during that time. One of the most shocking of those was we learned about brain plasticity. We also learned that the brain continues to develop until age 25, and we didn't know that forever. But the other thing that happened because of that is we started to understand a little more about genetics. We started to understand some of the influence of factors within the environment. And we started to understand more about trauma and attachment and how both of those aligned with child development impacted different mental health diagnoses and symptoms. We started to also understand more about developmental issues surrounding children, and even looked back to understand symptoms in adults that could have been explained by that earlier research. So the decade of the brain was just the beginning. It has led to continued focus and growth in terms of psychotropic medications. And I think what they really represented behind all that, was the idea that living with mental illness does not mean that you're living with an illness that has no positive effect on your life. You know, we expanded our view of what living with mental illness means in terms of resilience and strength. And one of the reasons for that, which is very significant, is that individuals who are living with mental illness were their best advocates. At the time of these movements, they spoke out, they emerged, their voices were heard. And because of that, on a national, state, and local level, we started to see the change in our systems and service delivery with the implementation of recovery-oriented principles. What this was a dramatic shift from the medical model to a more partnership with clients in terms of therapeutic needs and the process to get there. Some of you probably recall, if you've worked in the field a while, when the SAMHSA recovery-oriented principles dictate came about in 2004, we also saw on a state level in Pennsylvania a call for change. And that is continuing to be a process of development and reemergence of what it is that we need to do to best serve those individuals who are living with mental illness. Another part that was part of the recovery movement had to do a lot with policies. And part of policy, of course, is funding, and part of funding is also the advent of some new programming. So I wanted to just kind of provide this arrow to give you a sense of it took decades for that to happen. I mentioned before about the Community Mental Health Services Act in 1963. That happened and was made possible because of a shift in ideology about what mental illness means and how it can be identified and served. What is it that we can do to make life better if you have a diagnosis with mental illness? And part of that, again, was the confrontation of the medical model. And we started to see emerge a whole anti-psychiatry movement in the 1970s. There were kind of like two camps, a little bit of a pushback of individuals who are working as psychiatrists and working in the field and said, you know what, I think that we're wrong about some of this. But the other part of this, which is a great part of any movement, is it gives an opening for change. And one of those change was, as I mentioned before, the emergence of new voices, consumers who were activists and advocates and spoke out and made people aware of what needed to be changed and for why. And part of that was a better understanding about what recovery is. Recovery is not an outcome. Recovery is not about cure. Recovery is a process. It's about identity. And later, I think you'll understand that there's another word that I'm going to add to that was part of my discovery through this process. As I mentioned before, that as ideas shifted, as change happened on a policy level, it happened at a service level, it happened in a response in the community level, it also came about that there was more changes in how complex the system of care evolved. And through that came through a lot of different levels of services could be provided, not only for individuals living with mental illness, but with individuals. So some of these was the beginning of where we started to see more peer support programs, consumer-driven programs. It was moving past that concept of medical model and a power struggle to more of a partnership. And the idea of psychiatric rehabilitation programs became really important to me when I started to look for a setting at which to explore this. But behind all this, I knew existed this phenomenon of stigma. The timeline of stigma, I felt, was really important to go back to, because what happened is many of us, I think, who have been I was a psychology major. So one of the first books that I learned about stigma was Irving Goffman's Stigma, Notes on Management of Spoiled Identities. And that was 1963. So what we learned through his work with St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., was we started to get an inkling about what the experiences of individuals living with mental illness was like. In a key part of stigma, and again, I think I was first introduced to the word of stigma as being a mark, the stigmata. Even back in ancient Greece, we were aware of individuals who were perceived as different because of a physical deformity. Those individuals were set apart as markedly different from others. It was the beginning of that concept of the other, us, them. So when I look back on some of the beginnings here, my research indicated that at the beginning, some of the early asylums were done for protective reasons. The idea was being if you gathered people together who had a similar ailment, their needs could be met in a setting such as an asylum, and they would be protected. They would be cared for. So maybe there were good intentions there, but certainly it had some pretty negative consequences. And one of the problems was that is, and this is true, is that very often when people don't understand a problem, they're afraid of it. And from that fear, it can be then transitioned to the person who is different as being dangerous. I'm not just afraid of the problem because I don't know anything about it. I'm afraid of you. So there where we started to see that beginning of labels, we also saw the effect of these labels. Individuals with mental illness were treated as being dangerous. And the powerful effect of that, particularly when you think of how those the modified labeling effect of how people are socialized to believe that. The difficulty with that, which was really critically, and I heard it through many of the individuals I spoke with, is that when you have a concept or a belief in your own mind about people with mental illness, and then you are diagnosed with mental illness, what do you do with that conflict? Where do you make that choice? Am I like them? Am I like the family member who no one wanted to be around because they were afraid? Am I like the stereotype that I was taught to believe in? So Bruce Link, Joe Phelan, Patrick Corrigan were all powerful names in my research. And they started to take this problem apart, and they really looked at this process of stigma. What does it do? Looking at it from many different dimensions, such as social cognitive theory and looking at it in terms of modified labeling theory. What does it do to a person? Do they become aware that they're stereotyped as different? Do they accept it? Is it part of who they are then? So Patrick Corrigan was somebody who really looked at ways to begin to confront it. And one of the most powerful beginnings was the public stigma campaigns, with the thinking of, if we will change people's thinking about mental illness if we take a very active and advocacy role and educate the community about it. If we expose them, make them aware that it's not just them, other people who have this illness. It is people you know. It is people you love in the community. It's your family members. So there was a lot of focus done on public education, on public stigma programming, awareness programming. One that you may be aware of was, I think in maybe 2006, we saw a rise of PSAs supported by the program Bring Change to Mind. They were excellent. And what they were really doing is bringing attention to be aware of this, be kind. The other thing that I think was critical to the phenomenon that I was studying is not just that stigma exists, but as I said before, what does it do to you? Does it become internalized? And does it become internalized to a point that it drives your actions, that it shapes your self-esteem, that it becomes part of your identity? The paradox of that is that it wasn't the same across for everyone. The paradox was that, yes, for some people, it was a very negative experience. It lowered their self-esteem. For other people, it empowered them to push back with righteous anger, according to Corrigan, Watson, and Pat Deegan. And for others, they seemed completely unnerved, indifferent to it. Some other research voices that were powerful for this study was she. And in 2004, what she looked about is that how do people manage stigma? She developed two models that she said were really centered on coping and empowerment. And the reason for that is she said that the level of people, how people manage is either they compensate with the development of skills, or they begin to navigate their environment in a way to look at how can I manage this part of me in dealing with others who may not accept me. You know, does this make me more likely to engage with people like me more than others? And then there was the concept too of multiple identities, that maybe there's a part of some individuals that are kept hidden for fear of rejection, so that they emphasize more in becoming a more dominant identity that would be accepting. This research was fascinating to me. What it made me do is not to take one of these in the SHE study and run with it, but it was to tuck it away in what Kathy Charmez would say, in grounded theory approach, is a sensitizing concept. It was my point of departure. It was what I wanted to listen for as I developed this study. So there were three primary focus areas for my research. I was looking at stigma awareness. I wanted to know what the experience was like in the context of mental health recovery. And I used 5 questions to really guide me through that process. How was it experienced? Now, as I mentioned before, the people who were recruited to be in my study, they came from clubhouse programs. Clubhouse programs are therapeutic, non-clinical, intentional communities. They have a presence in local communities. I wanted to understand from that vantage point, how have you experienced it? You're in a setting that is a non-clinical. You're in a setting where you're surrounded by social supports. I was hoping that that would create a sense of safety to share such a personal and sensitive topic. I also wanted to explore what are some of the factors that contribute and how does that awareness impact your interactions. Again, that concept of symbolic interaction stigma is a stigma that you feel out there internalized to the point that you begin to anticipate it in interactions with others. So I was very interested to see is as a program, if the Clubhouse program openly acknowledged stigma, if it was discussed. And then I wanted to explore, kind of for future references, how would it impact mental health recovery in general? Here is another one of my guides has shared. What this focused on the idea, it became making me more aware that stigma exists within the systems we work. We label individuals. And in this case, he's talking about the educational system. So years ago, people in the system thought I was mentally retarded, and other kids in my class and teachers made fun of me. And that affects your ability to succeed. It's all connected. Back then, if your family had problems, you were labeled and ignored. The teachers liked the kids with good families and no problems, and they ignored the rest of us. And this was when I realized that I wasn't going to just hear about stigma by John Q. Public. I was going to hear about stigma within the systems that we were a part of. So to give you a little more information about the Clubhouse program, Clubhouse programs are considered psychiatric rehabilitation or psychosocial programs. They actually are such a well-kept secret. To me, they were magical. 1948 was the beginning of Clubhouse programs, the Fountain House in New York. And it was really done in a grassroots effort in that it was patients of psychiatric hospitals gathered together and in providing support to each other as they, were working to find employment and become more integrated into the community. Today, there are over 300 Clubhouse programs across 30 plus countries. They are considered, as definition, a therapeutic, non-clinical, intentional community. Their primary focus is social and occupational rehabilitation. So their presence in the community is very closely connected to opportunities for job placement, for training, for vocational guidance and counseling, and also job employment, seeking employment, employment skills. There are standards, 36 standards, I believe, for accreditation to be part of the Clubhouse program. So the Clubhouse model has very clearly defined definitions of what is the foundation or the context for how to implement this model in the local communities. One of the things that was most significant to me was walking into the Clubhouse settings, which were really welcoming. I visited 4, and the standards were all along the wall. And there were 4 core principles that stood out. I believe it was the right to belong, the right to meaningful employment, the right to meaningful relationships, and the right to return. So the concept was that if you become a member in a clubhouse, it is a lifetime membership. In recruiting members to participate in my study, I set the criteria of being 18. I did that for several reasons. Before I even chose the clubhouse, was because I knew that there were many diagnoses where the age of onset was past 18. All clubhouse members are adults, are over 18. I wanted to make it clear that this was a voluntary study participation and that there was no compensation. Before I even introduced the program to recruit members, there were two levels of compliance that I had to go through. One was with community services group compliance, and also the IRB at Widener in order to protect the rights of human subjects. So it was a process, it was one that began, long before I entered that first step in the clubhouse. But I think the more research I did, the more validating it was that this was exactly where I needed to be to study this issue. I made it clear that I was looking for individuals to participate who would be able to participate in two 90-minute, maximum 90-minute interviews. And I wanted individuals to be active members of the clubhouse for at least 3 months, because I felt it would help that they had a better sense of what this participation was about. And also that they had participated in mental health treatment at least 6 months. And I did that more because I knew that this was a sensitive topic. And I believe that that there was a level of support needed in recovery in order to begin to talk about this sensitive process and sensitive conversations with me. So the design of the study also took a lot of thought. Basically, I wanted it to be a mixed method study. I wanted to use some quantitative scales by Bruce Link to really create that powerful foundation to have the conversation, because primarily my interviews were qualitative interviews. They were open-ended. They were driven by questions. But I used the scales, and that's why it is considered embedded, as a place to start. I didn't want to define what stigma was. I wanted to use a method, scales that were tested and would be both reliable and valid in the language that we used to begin this conversation about stigma. I also was deeply committed to the concept of a grounded theory approach. And that took a little bit of defending, but I knew that stigma, I believed, was a phenomenon that was socially constructed. And I wanted to understand the views and to use the words of Kathy Charmez, who is the founder of the constructivist grounded theory approach, in that I wanted a view from the inside. I wanted to understand how this experience is felt and observed and perceived from individuals who are living it. So I had a very strong reason that I wasn't going to approach this with any kind of hypotheses. I was going to approach with a sense of unknowing, in that I would be open to whatever would be revealed. This is just an example, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, of one of the scales. There were 3 scales developed by Bruce Link and Joe Phelan that I used. One was about consciousness. The other was about perceived devaluation and discrimination. So moving about, do you know what stigma is? How are you aware of it? How do you have experienced it, either yourself or indirectly other people? And then there was the idea of, do you anticipate it? Does that type of exposure and experience shape in you a sense of concern as you interact with others in the community? If there was any question about an awareness of stigma, that was quickly disputed as I talked with many of the people that I interviewed. They made it clear that most of them had stigma radar. They knew it, they could sense it, even sometimes before any words were spoken. But they also wanted to make it clear to me that stigma is always there. It's always there. And it's also, in some ways, it's carefully chosen, the targets. And so this last one really had an impact on me, and that one individual whose roommate was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He mentioned that he knew through their conversations, he said, I would say that those who suffer from hallucinations are treated the worst by society. And I thought back to that research that talked a lot about that concept of deviance and danger as being closely related. So I was very fortunate, although this was a convenient sample. I think that my sample, the characteristics as you see, crosses all ages and experiences of where they live, and also treatment history and employment history. Most significant, I think, in looking at this is most of the individuals that I spoke with had been in treatment for at least 2 years. Another point I want to make is that the mental health diagnoses, these were the diagnoses shared by the individuals. This is how they reported their primary diagnosis. And as you can see, I think in a few slides later, in some of the quotes, remember from the arrows, we crossed the path of the DSM-3, the DSM-4, the DSM-4-TR, the DSM-5. So individuals were diagnosed under a lot of different levels of categories over the course of time. So there were some individuals who shared that they had been misdiagnosed, but this is currently what they had. And also, I didn't mean to put autism spectrum in this concept of mental health disorders, but again, the individuals who shared this, it was before we really started to look at developmental disorders in a different way. So what was impressive to me about the clubhouse was not just the welcoming feeling that I felt. It was the way that people that I interviewed described it. What they described was a sense of belonging, that they were individuals here, unique, and that it gave them a place to feel what it's like to be accepted. The other thing is in bringing about the reasoning for validating why I was so glad that I chose the clubhouse is that many individuals said they learned about what mental illness meant when they became active in the clubhouse. They started to get a sense that it's not just me who is dealing with problems, but many people have also struggled with symptoms, have also struggled over the course of time of new symptoms. And so this individual who had a family member who had been diagnosed, talked about that discovery, that early time of what it was like to know that there was something wrong, but not quite know what it was. And that feeling of despair that kind of came over one who was trying to make peace with this diagnosis or what this understanding means. And as shared was this last one, I felt like I was done. I lost my job, but then I got the job at the bakery. And the bakery was part of a network of support services connected to the clubhouse in that location. So I had 18 individuals and spoke to each of them about 90 minutes. So there were 360 pages of transcriptions. I created a lot of different charts in order for me to process the data that I had gathered and then later analyze it. And I just want to mention quickly, the coding process was intense. I started out in looking at 385 codes, which then I got down to 120, then down to 78. And then I started to recognize a sort of a phenomenon that happened even within this study is that people shared that they felt one way, but if I had asked them 10 years ago or even 10 weeks ago, that their answers may have been different. So I realized that what I needed to do is what Saldana calls splitting too. I looked at going back to some of the individuals to verify what it is that they said. So I was sure about the meaning in doing the codes. And I had to look at the context of the transcriptions, the codes within the quotes, so that I wasn't just taking out random words and defining them in myself. I wanted to see them in the context of the conversation. So I ended up with 72 codes. And this is kind of an example of how the charting that I did, so that I could kind of see how the research questions were really shaping my process to gather information. And then look for the different categories of how the quotes shared, as well as the information from the scales, were shaping my understanding. And here's some of the examples of the results. So using these scales, you can see a lot of differences in how people thought. And one of them was, I think what came out here is that, yes, stigma still exists. People are biased against individuals with mental illness. And despite that, despite of how people judge, it may not affect me today. There were 3 points made here: that being in the hospital has a powerful effect on how people view you and whether they accept you in the community. And that it carries with you, I think, a stereotype of danger. And that also could impact the type of job which you may be seen as capable of being an applicant for. One of the things that I thought I saw in here too was the idea that social relationships didn't seem as impacted as much as the general community or even getting a job. You know, that concept of maybe when people get to know you, you have a chance. There are people who will accept you. So the anticipate scale, as I mentioned, is the third scale, and that was the one that really looked at that concept of, you know, is the stigma internalized to a point, you know, using the theory of symbolic interactionism, where you start to see in others that they see you in that way, and that might deter you from interacting on a personal level with them. And this was significant in a few ways. You worry that people think of you as a person with mental illness and nothing else. 10 people said very often. You feel that people might stop being your friend if they knew you were hospitalized. Look at the reverse answer to that. Almost never. So again, I think it's that concept of once you have sort of proven yourself, people will follow you and trusting you, loving you. When I asked about the acknowledgement of stigma in the Clubhouse community, I think what I learned is not so much that it is directly discussed, as much as the Clubhouse community creates such a safe and supportive place, that it gives individuals a chance to process how they feel about it. And that time makes a big difference in that ability to use this experience and grow from it. So I want to bring attention to 2 of these things, which I sort of came from the scales. 55% of the people, which would be 10, said that they experienced layers of stigma. That was their word. So that idea that you're experiencing stigma from many different systems in many different settings. Similar to the woman before who talked about it was, you know, if you didn't know the answers in class, you were stigmatized. If your eyes were different, if, you know, she said she had a problem with her eyes, that gave her a stigma. So again, that concept of many layers and a cumulative effect. The other thing was many individuals shared that they had had a family history. I think it was 12 out of 18. They talked about a family member who had, and how they were treated, the dehumanizing treatment they experienced or heard about from their family, who had been diagnosed at a time when the mental health system was still struggling with the concept of community-based care. So one individual had talked about the fact of hardly ever seeing her mother who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Um, her home visits were very minimal. She wasn't home often at all. None of the scales really got this deep, but my questions, because of some of the answers that were shared with me, helped me to get deeper with it. There are different kinds of stigma. There's an attitude. There's an attitude by the system, depending upon the population served, depending upon the needs of the person. You know, what they talk about sometimes is that stigma's this omnipresent, powerful force. And depending upon where you are and what it is you need, if you look closely, you'll see it, although it might be hidden. The cumulative effect of stigma was something that we talked a lot about too. And as indicated here, I knew some people that the stigma affected their way of thinking and then it just knocked them down. So what he was saying is it's whether or not it has the power to hold you back is very individual. And it might be because that person has just hit their limit of how much they can handle, being exposed to it over and over again. I thought that this one was interesting too, in that in experiencing it, this individual puts stigma into the context of judging. That idea that if you just did this, 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 and this, you'd have a better life. You'd be better. So this kind of does touch on the idea that maybe to some degree public awareness programs related to mental illness are still necessary because, as mentioned here, people are so uneducated and expect everyone to be like them. People think that we should have to adjust to the mental illness, and they never think that maybe they should adjust to us. At some point, although I had never initially expected this or looked for this, I discovered that acceptance was the heart and the soul of this. And it wasn't about creating a network of acceptance. It wasn't about creating a setting of welcoming. It was about self-acceptance. It was about that day of reckoning, of seeing that this is a part of who you are, and that's okay. And this was some of the, again, all of these individuals are from different places, had never met each other. But what they were talking about is that we all experience some level of adversity. And if you open your mind and heart to someone, it doesn't matter who you are, that helps. And this individual talked about a tremendous 360. And once that change happens, it enables a lot of positive things to happen. This other individual talked about acceptance as requiring a thicker skin. So yes, stigma is still there, still is powerful, always present. But maybe there comes a point when with self-acceptance, we can handle it. Acceptance was the theme, the most powerful theme. The choice of language that some individuals used to explain it was different. In this individual, the choice was the word willingness. You have to have the willingness to use the opportunity that's here, meaning the clubhouse, but the willingness comes from me to help myself. I can remember some of the times of my illness when it was really bad. I had it really bad coming here. I feel respected because I do not get the same reaction outside. So the point was being that the clubhouse gave an opportunity to feel acceptance. And from that, those seeds, all positive things could happen. Again, noting here, because my outlook changed. Talking about it being as bad as wanting to kill yourself. I couldn't see my purpose or meaning. I basically looked at my life and thought that I've had enough of this bullcrap. I needed to make changes and be the best that I can be. I knew that I needed to do what I needed to do to turn that around. So in this case, the experience of stigma was motivating. This might be an example of that self-righteous anger. And again, coming back to the idea of different terms of what to call it, instead of calling it or seeing it as a disability, I think of it as a uniqueness. Now, the stigma model that was created took a lot of time, not just the analysis of the data and the quotes, but I started to look at these themes and tried to see them in some order of what emerges what. And that was where I got that sense of like the concept of time. Many individuals talked about their first feelings and thoughts related both to stigma and to the diagnosis. And it gave them a chance to see themselves in a place of growth. It gave them a chance to frame it as acceptance, self-acceptance, because it had to do with that idea of the reality of living with mental illness. It is me, is what they were saying, accepting that this is me. And this is the model that was designed in. Sorry. All of these pieces, what I really started out with is looking at the stigma experience and trying to unpack it. What is it? It's labels, it's attitudes, it's misconceptions, it's actions. It exists in personal interactions, and it also exists within systems. We are not immune to dehumanizing attitudes and actions, to stereotyping, to bias, to discrimination. The stigma experience certainly is directly connected to the experience of recovery, and the stigma experience for some people may have made them cautious about the clubhouse experience too. It's still present, it's still powerful. It, according to the research, could be a powerful barrier to mental health recovery. But in this case, these individuals told me that self-acceptance creates a powerful factor that enables, that mediates some of this, that enables us to gain a better sense of the value of mental health recovery, of incorporate mental health recovery into your identity, that process is made possible through acceptance. I think the implications are practices that I had to listen. The implications is to own it. The implications is to understand it. The implications is to be able to look for it and recognize it and talk about it. Here was one of the powerful sharings that stayed with me too a long time. Some people in the system read your files or your background. They're biased because they look at you as a label and not as a person, and it ruins it because they don't understand you as a person. And once you're labeled, this was from another individual, you have to prove yourself every day, prove you are worth it. And in this case, this individual talked about his experience in the prison system. And he said, so it's not just about, proving yourself, but trying to survive. And sometimes you lose hope. And this person challenged my use of the word mental illness. He challenged society's framing of mental illness as a disability. And what he described, the gift of coming to the clubhouse and staying as an active member and loving every day of it, is that he enjoyed being with people who have what he called mental dilemmas. I like to call it mental dilemmas instead of illness or disease, because a dilemma is uncertain and could go either way, and that's pretty much what a mental illness can be. People may not know what will help and how this can help, and may not yet know that there is a positive side to this mental dilemma. I shared this with the directors of the program. It was one of those wordles that you put together just by tossing in all of the themes, or at least in this case, a portion of the themes that came together. And this is what came about. I love random algorithms like this. but it took me to exactly where I think I have. And it took me back, I think, to, as I told you, the first book that really introduced me to to the concept of stigma, to the phenomenon. And I think I missed this when I first read it. This is Erving Goffman. He, meaning the stigmatized individual, may also see the trials he has suffered as a blessing in disguise, especially because of what it is felt that suffering can teach one about life and people. I am eternally grateful to the Community Services Group for giving me the chance to do this, for all of the personnel who welcomed me and made me feel at home. And in meeting them, I can appreciate and understand that they conveyed that same sense of welcoming to the wonderful 18 people I met through this process. If you are interested in more information about this, please contact me. Here is my email address and my phone number. I will answer every and all. This was such a wonderful lesson and a wonderful journey. Thank you.